On June the 2nd, Polish Prime Minister Donald Tusk announced that he would call for a parliamentary vote of confidence in his coalition government.
Ten plan
This plan will require unity and courage from the entire October 15th coalition. The first test will be a vote of confidence, which I will ask Parliament soon. I want everyone to see, including our opponents at home and abroad, that we are ready for this situation. This announcement comes after the presidential election on Sunday, which saw Tusk's candidate, Rafał Trzaskowski, defeated by Karol Nawrocki, an independent candidate who received the full endorsement of the Law and Justice, the main opposition party. The presidential election was widely seen as a referendum on Donald Tusk's coalition government, which has grown increasingly unpopular since it came to power in December 2023. Tusk promised many reforms during the 2023 election campaign. Since being elected, however, the government has been notoriously lazy, barely implementing any of the oft-quoted 100 reforms which they promised for the first 100 days of government. The presidency, which in Poland holds veto power, was still held by Law and Justice ally Andrzej Duda, and a common line cited by the coalition is that they could not pass their reforms because they were all being vetoed by the president. However, over the course of the 1.5 years of Tusk's coalition being in power, Duda has vetoed a total of 5 bills. Indeed, the laziness of Tusk's government is a well-known factor, not just among right-wing parties. So instead of getting down to work, Prime Minister Tusk will now be bringing his sidekicks into line. And I have just one question. Have you really learnt nothing? On June the 1st, the curtain came crashing down. Trzaskowski's defeat was not an accident, but a result. This is what happens when you fail to keep promises made to millions of people. Why are you doing nothing about the growing hole in the healthcare funding? We could have voted on it a week and a half ago, but your MPs didn't even bother coming to work. Calling for a vote of confidence right after Sunday's bitter defeat is most likely a move by Tusk to salvage his government's image, which is currently in freefall. It will be a sort of consolidation of his coalition, a signal that despite having lost the bid for the presidency, his government is still standing proud and united. Perhaps this is being done in anticipation of the new president making some kind of move towards calling for an early parliamentary election. We have a majority, but we also have ideas, we have a vision, we have reached some conclusions. In my opinion, these two things should go hand in hand. The vote of confidence will be held on June the 11th. If all goes according to plan, Tusk should win the vote. However, things may not necessarily go according to plan. There are already voices in the coalition who are considering sinking the government. Today, after announcing that his government would get to work, Tusk himself failed to show up Tuesday's parliamentary sitting, adding to his government's image as a bunch of do-nothings. Much can happen in a week. After Karol Nawrocki's victory in the presidential election, Donald Trump, the 47th President of the United States, quoted a comment from the American station Newsmax. Trump ally wins in Poland, shocking all in Europe. Congratulations, Poland, you picked a winner. Marco Rubio, the head of American diplomacy, also spoke about Nawrocki's election victory. Congratulations to President-elect Karol Nawrocki on a hard-earned victory as a new chapter begins in Poland. Together, the United States and Poland will forge the most ambitious alliance in our shared history on defense, energy and commerce. Polish-American relations have their best days ahead of them. A new chapter in our mutual relations is indeed beginning. It is no secret that Karol Nawrocki's victory means continuation of President Andrzej Duda's policy of exemplary Polish-American relations. I have no doubt that President Trump will continue to invest in this relationship in some way, at least in terms of image. If so, this is good for Poland because the United States is our most important ally. It would be very disadvantageous for us if Rafał Trzaskowski were president, and relations with him were as tense as with Donald Tusk. Karol Nawrocki's victory in the race for the presidential palace also means the defeat of Donald Tusk's policy. This certainly further diminishes the status and importance of Donald Tusk among those European politicians who sought to push the United States out of Europe and strengthen German dominance in its place. It seems that Donald Tusk, after Trzaskowski's election defeat, would rather Poles forget that he is one of the leaders of European plans to push the United States out of the old continent. Karol Nawrocki said very clearly, for Poland to be safe, they must have strong transatlantic relations. No to NATO bis. We are in NATO. America is in NATO. The vast majority of European countries are in NATO. NATO needs to be developed, not some additional structures created. This is very good news. Polish-American relations have been saved. They will develop very well. Interestingly, after the elections, the participants of the coalition led by Donald Tusk seem to have forgotten about the plans for the so-called independence of Europe without the United States. Personally, I have never felt or perceived this as pushing the United States out. I would say quite the opposite. I have not heard anyone say that they want to push the US out. Rather, I have heard Prime Minister Tusk say that this alliance is strategic for our security. The United States is our most important ally, especially in the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. And I hope that these good relations will continue. The Polish president will keep an eye on Donald Tusk's government to ensure that these relations are as good as possible. But of course, the president cannot replace the government. It is the government's policy, a policy directed against the United States, a pro-German and therefore anti-American policy. That is and remains a problem for the security of our homeland. Even during the election campaign, during his visit to the White House, Karol Nawrocki sought to promote Polish interests. Karol Nawrocki will certainly strive for the best possible relations with the Americans. We already have the beginnings of this because even during the campaign there was a direct meeting. It is not often that the incumbent president receives a candidate in the Oval Office at the White House, but it was clear that the Americans were focusing on the centre-right in Poland, and they were not mistaken. That is why, shortly after Karol Nawrocki's visit to Washington, the United States lifted the restrictions imposed by the previous Biden administration on the transfer to Poland of the latest American technologies used in the creation of artificial intelligence. Karol Nawrocki's presidency will also focus on these modern technologies. He is a man who understands modern technologies, which is why he talked about issues related to modern technologies while he was still campaigning in the White House. The question is what will happen after the elections to the ideas promoted by Brussels, Berlin and Paris, such as a European NATO base without the United States, or a mythical European army that is supposed to protect the Union from Russia. Plans to push the Americans out of Europe to differentiate themselves from them will, in my opinion, be implemented. This is in the interest of those parts of Europe that have a different geopolitical position from Poland and different interests from Poland. I hope that this will end as soon as possible, but this requires a Prime Minister to resign, because so far there are no European soldiers permanently stationed in Poland. Only thousands of soldiers from the United States. The balance of power between the United States, Russia and Europe is clear. If we want to save Europe, defend Europe from the Russian threat, an alliance with the United States is necessary. And any ideas of strategic autonomy, that is breaking away from the United States, are simply a mistake. Poland is essential for the Americans to simply stay here. That means that we are once again playing an extremely important geopolitical role. One thing seems certain. Karol Nawrocki's victory will mean a rapprochement with the United States and, perhaps, the beginning of the end of Donald Tusk's pro-German government.
First, an explosion under one of the pillars. Then, a massive attack by underwater drones. The bridge over the Kerch Strait, connecting Russian territory with the occupied Crimea, has become the target of another daring operation by Ukrainian special forces in recent days. According to unofficial information, a Ukrainian delegation is on its way to the United States. Kyiv is pushing for the introduction of sanctions being prepared by U.S. senators. This is the moment of the morning explosion recorded by one of the bridge's surveillance cameras, which was hacked by Ukrainian hackers. It is unclear whether a powerful explosive device was placed under the bridge or whether one of the underwater drones was used. Another attack was to begin a few hours later. The condition of the bridge is still unknown. The fact is that traffic in both directions has been suspended. This is another intelligence operation following the attack on Russian airports, in which, as satellite photos reveal, up to 40 Russian aircraft were damaged. The total losses of the Russian Air Force are estimated at up to $7 billion.
Russia must feel what its losses mean. That is what will push it toward diplomacy. And when Russia takes losses in this war, it's obvious to everyone that Ukraine is the one holding the line, not just for itself, but for all of Europe.
The problem is that, first of all, it is an unequal fight. And secondly, Europe is helping on the one hand, but on the other, it is still co-financing the Russian war machine. As revealed by BBC journalists, since the suspension of gas supplies from Russia through Ukraine last year, transit through Turkey has skyrocketed. According to the media, Western Europe has paid over 200 billion euros to Russia for gas and oil since the invasion began. This is more than the military aid provided to Ukraine. This shows double standards and political hypocrisy on the part of those European leaders who should be demonstrating through their actions that they really want nothing to do with Russia. This is significant because among the biggest beneficiaries of trade with Russia are those who are now calling loudest for pressure to be put on the Kremlin. We borrowed a wax figure of Emmanuel Macron from the museum and then symbolically displayed it in front of the Russian embassy to condemn the double standards of the French government and President Macron in relation to the war in Ukraine. We believe that today the French government and Emmanuel Macron are prioritizing trade with Russia in many sectors of the economy, particularly in chemical fertilizers, gas, and uranium imports, at the expense of resolving the conflict. In 2024, France was the main importer of liquefied gas from Russia in Europe. Germany and Austria also import it. Some German politicians even believe that the Nord Stream gas pipeline should be rebuilt and cooperation with Moscow resumed. Such attempts could threaten the security of the region and undermine the credibility not only of the West as Ukraine's allies, but also of NATO. This is all the more so because it was Paris and Berlin that undermined the unity of the alliance in the context of U.S. security policy under Donald Trump.
Let me be very straightforward here. Since January, I get two questions from European allies. Question one is the US still committed to NATO? The answer is yes. Committed to NATO, committed to Article 5, and this has been many times repeated by President Trump in many meetings.
Given the anti-American agenda and the simultaneous pro-Russian business deals, the question arises as to what Germany and France are trying to play at. Officially, they are calling for an arms race, increased defense spending, and support for Ukraine. Unofficially, however, they are feeding the bear we are supposed to defend ourselves against.
The Federal Administrative Court in Berlin ruled that sending asylum seekers back at the German border is illegal. The court found that Germany had violated EU regulations, in particular the Dublin Regulation, which obliges member states to determine which of them is responsible for processing asylum applications. Will this decision lead to a more assertive stance by the Polish government toward German immigration policy? The German court's ruling is a serious blow to the immigration policy of Chancellor Friedrich Merz and Interior Minister Alexander Dobrindt, who, continuing Scholz's decisions, have opted for a tough migration policy and the return of immigrants to neighboring countries, including Poland.
Zaskakuje mnie, że kanclerz Merz
I am surprised that Chancellor Merz and his government did not know from the outset that the practice they were implementing was against the law. Worse still, the Minister of the Interior and the Chancellor himself have already publicly announced that they disagree with the Berlin court's ruling, even though the issue is clear and obvious. The ruling concerns the case of 3 Somali citizens, 2 men and 1 woman, who arrived from Poland on May 9 and applied for asylum at the train station in Frankfurt-Oder. However, they were immediately deported back without their applications being considered. The court ruled that the government's actions violated applicable asylum laws. What will this mean for Poland? After such rulings, one would expect that, under pressure from public opinion and the media, Polish authorities would begin to react and refuse to allow such illegal actions. If Poland had a normal government, this ruling would have changed the whole situation and provided a basis for dealing with the crisis on the western border and simply closing that western border. In May, the Merz government announced a new, stricter migration policy, including a complete suspension of asylum procedures, a freeze on the processing of applications, and the return of migrants at the borders. The German authorities are maintaining increased controls on their side of the border and declare that they have already sent almost 10,000 legal immigrants back to Poland. These people should be returned to Germany immediately, to the German courts, so that the German courts can decide on their status in accordance with European law, and I have no doubt that these people should stay in Germany and await the outcome of all procedures there. On May 26th, journalists from Poland's TV Republika published documents belonging to a migrant from Somalia, which were issued to him by the German authorities. They show that the man's destination was Poland. The case is very suspicious and raises questions as to whether Germany is pointing to Poland as a destination for migrants in order to have an excuse to deport to Poland migrants who may be unwanted in Germany. We are talking about one person here, but no one knows how many such people there really are. Those who would know have a huge incentive to hide that information. Every migrant sent from Germany to Poland is a fiscal drain on the Polish taxpayer. Yet, for now, migrants continue to flow through the border.